The annals of World War II aviation are filled with aircraft that soared to legendary status. We all know the P-51 Mustang, the Messerschmitt Me-210, the Supermarine Spitfire, the Hellcat, the Sturmovik, the list goes on and on. But for every outstanding warbird, there were one or two duds along the way, some that failed at the testing stage and others that, unfortunately, made it to frontline units, where they could show off their deficiencies on an operational scale. Today, we'll look at a handful. The American dive bomber that often made its pilots and designers question their life choices, the German heavy fighter that didn't like to fly in a straight line, and the Italian thoroughbred that performed in combat more like it was inbred. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Airliner Designs, and today we'll be taking a nosedive into 3 poorly designed aircraft from World War II. 1943. A young pilot can see the enemy carrier up ahead. He rolls his big plane into a lazy dive and lines up on target. But then, the thing begins to shake so much he can't even see what he's aiming for. It sounds absurd, but this was the reality for many pilots of the Curtiss SB2C, officially nicknamed the Helldiver, but fondly remembered by pilots as the son of a bitch second class. Yeah, they loved it. Designed to be faster, stronger, and deadlier than what had come before it, the Helldiver looked promising on paper but would ultimately make its pilots pray for an early retirement. It was developed as a replacement for the venerable SBD Dauntless, which had been developed from the archaic Northrop BT-1 and 2 from back in the mid-30s. The SBD performed admirably though, especially at midway, but with a relatively small payload and sluggish performance, it was clear the old Dauntless needed a successor. What followed was a design and manufacturing nightmare that would see an aircraft rushed through production with even its own designers keenly aware of its deficiencies and desperately trying to work them out. A 1938 specification had called for an aircraft with a crew of 2, boasting a more powerful Wright R2620 twin cyclone engine, a top speed exceeding 290 miles per hour, a large bomb bay capable of carrying 1,000 pounds of ordnance, and to be shut with hydraulic doors, folding wings for easier carrier storage, something the old Dauntless bafflingly didn't have, and room enough for a variety of heavy equipment like cameras and an impressively sized radio. Now, as if that weren't already enough, the aircraft's frame had to be heavily reinforced for that dive bombing, but also light enough to be able to operate from aircraft carriers with all the requisite arrestor and catapult hooks. Phew, now if that sounds like it's asking a lot, you'd be right. It is. But both Brewster and Curtiss Wright submitted designs which, curiously, actually look a lot like each other. Curtiss's first prototype, the XSB2C-1, was in production when, in November 1940, the Navy placed an order for 200 aircraft even before the thing had flown. Now, this kind of thing wasn't unusual at all in the world of government military procurement at the time, but it would prove to be a catastrophic decision, because when the XSB2C-1 did finally take to the skies, it had qualities that could only be described as worrying.
This new giant aviation plant is completing its first warplane. At Columbus, Ohio, the Curtiss Wright factory is the nation's largest for the building of dive bombers for the Navy.
But there was no backing down now. The huge Navy order had resulted in a drive to hire 14,000 workers and build an entirely new production plant just for this plane. From the outset, the Helldiver was beset by problems. The prototype first took flight December 18, 1940, and flights revealed major structural and stability issues. The aircraft's tail vibrated violently. Stability was terrible, and the performance was just sluggish. All that on top of the usual teething troubles with new aircraft, like electrical failures and engine problems. In February 1941, the thing crashed when its engine failed on approach. This would normally give designers pause for thought, but with production starting very, very soon, Curtiss's engineers had to quickly rebuild their plane and get it back into testing as soon as possible. They took the opportunity to rework the design, lengthening the fuselage and enlarging the tail to combat those severe instability issues. They had just 10 months to iron out all the kinks and begin deliveries of finished production models. That's just not a lot of time. So you can only imagine Curtiss's dismay when, in December, when they should have been delivering production aircraft, the rebuilt prototype disintegrated mid-flight during a high-speed dive, forcing test pilot BT Hulse to bail out to safety. Now that should have been ringing some alarm bells, except that the US Army ordered 900 more of the things. The first production SB2C-1 rolled off the production line 6 months late in June 1942. Now, this was around the same time the Grumman TBF Avenger went into service, even though design on that had started 2 years later than on the Helldiver. Despite the issues, war production just couldn't wait. And with the Japanese tearing through the Pacific, the Navy was desperate for bombers. Flaws be damned. Navy pilots weren't thrilled. Professor of Aeronautical Engineering, Otto C. Koppen, exclaimed, "If they build more than one of these things, they're crazy." One thing became immediately apparent. The Helldiver was a pig to fly, and many pilots missed the old SPD Dauntless, which in some cases actually performed better. So what had gone wrong? The Helldiver's fuselage was fragile. So fragile that repeated structural failures occurred during the rigors of carrier operations. And in dives on target, pilots had to be mindful not to overstress the airframe, lest they find themselves unintentionally testing the limits of free fall physics. Some of those early carrier pilots never quite knew if a dive was going to end with a bomb drop or an unscheduled swim in the Pacific. The SB2C had been crammed full of impressive features like that big radio, the hydraulic bomb bay doors, and many more, but it meant its empty weight ballooned out from around 7,100 pounds on the prototype to 10,000 on the production model. The original engine was kept, meaning it had to strain against the mass of a lot more airplane. Now, big, ponderous, sluggish, heavy aircraft do not usually good carrier planes make. Inevitably, the landing gear had a mind of its own. Pilots and ground crews dreaded it, and it became notorious for failing at the worst possible moment. In an aircraft designed for carrier landings, this was not ideal. Fleet Air Arm pilot Eric Winkle Brown recalled that Yorktown's skipper, then Captain Joseph Clark, watched in horror as the ship's Helldivers came in for landing and either broke up, missed arrestor hooks, or had their gear collapse. According to Brown, Clark even petitioned the Navy to cancel the Helldiver altogether. In addition to this, for an aircraft designed to dive bomb enemy targets under heavy AA fire before scooting nimbly away, the SB2C handled like a drunken rhinoceros. It was slow to respond to control inputs, making it difficult to maneuver in combat, and its massive nose gave pilots poor visibility when lining up on the carrier. In action, pilots attempting to pull out of a steep dive had to fight the aircraft every step of the way. On top of all of that, the cockpit configuration was a hydraulic horror show. Nearly every function, from the gear and the flaps to the bomb bay doors and the wing folding, naturally relied on hydraulics. The interior of the aircraft resembled, according to Ticonderoga pilot George Walsh, a jungle of wires and hydraulic tubes. Now, this wasn't unique to the Helldiver at all, but coupled with poor workmanship from Curtiss, it meant that frequent leaks, failures, and unexpected malfunctions could naturally have dire consequences. So why did the Navy decide to stick with it rather than give it a one-way flight to the scrapyard? Well, the frantic Pacific War effort meant that carrier-based dive bombers were needed en masse, and replacing the Helldiver mid-war would have caused bad delays and shut down production lines staffed by thousands. Curtiss Wright was working pell-mell on churning them out, and cancelling the program just wasn't logistically feasible. Inevitably, it would have also led to a political scandal. In fact, a committee was set up to figure out just what the heck was going on with all those delayed and poor designs, and they were scathing of the Helldiver. Curtiss was just trying to keep up with the insane demands of the Navy. In fact, President Guy Vaughan would later say it was, quote, one of the biggest of the wartime crosses we had to bear. Later versions, like the SB2C3 and C4, saw incremental upgrades, including more powerful engines, a reinforced fuselage, and those improved dive brakes, but regardless, the Helldiver remained unpopular among pilots and crew. Even the British Royal Navy rejected the aircraft in favour of other models. Legendary pilot Winkle Brown weighed in on it when he recalled that the Fleet Air Arm Squadron number 1820 had formed up on Helldivers, but the aircraft was shipped back to the UK and the squadron was disbanded. We were not tardy, he said, in discovering the reason. The handling characteristics of the beast were such that it would never have been allowed near a British carrier deck. In tests, 1820 Squadron lost crews and aircraft, and 3 of the Helldivers failed to pull out of their dives. Brown concluded that it was the worst aircraft type he'd ever flown in turbulence, and that the control surfaces made aiming the thing very difficult. From the summer of 1942 on, the Curtiss team desperately set about trying to rectify the issues. The end result was an airplane with an outrageously sized tail to help with its horizontal control problems, and a heavily reinforced airframe, It took over 600 production aircraft and nearly 900 major design changes to create a version of the Helldiver that could perform. All that shaking during dives, which made it impossible for some pilots to even sight their target below, was a result of the dive brakes, which were really just the aircraft's flaps, which could be split up and down. The huge tail assembly was sitting so closely behind the wing that it was buffeted heavily from the disturbed airflow. In the end, the flaps were perforated with holes to try and help reduce the effect. Look, okay, it wasn't all bad news. Many pilots called it the beast, but quite a few pilots eventually came to like it and became quite proficient with it. By the war's end, Helldivers had helped sink mighty Japanese warships like the battleships Musashi and Yamato, but its legacy was forever tarnished thanks to all the engine and landing gear failures, the in-flight breakups, and the generally temperamental performance. The aircraft's design was eventually fixed with the C3, 4, and 5 models, but its reputation is unfortunate because ultimately, and somewhat incredibly, it flew over 18,000 combat sorties and it's thought to have sunk more than 300 Japanese ships. It's all very well and good to condemn the Helldiver today, but ask the crew of the Japanese warships Shimakaze, Wakatsuki, Asashimo, and many, many others, and they'd probably give you a very different opinion on the Helldiver's capabilities. In the post-war era, the Helldiver was phased out and Curtiss Wright's reputation had suffered irreparable damage. Not only thanks to the Helldiver saga, but for also supplying defective engines from their Ohio plant for 2 years. Lagging badly behind the competition in the fierce world of technological developments, Curtiss Wright shut down its entire aircraft design division in 1948, and even though they're actually still around today, they only make parts. The Helldiver is a curious plane because even in the face of anecdotes from pilots, ranging from humorous quips about its brick-like handling to grim tales of fatal carrier landings, 7,140 were built. That's over 1,000 more than the Junkers 87 Stuka, for goodness sake. So that's the complicated legacy of Curtiss's beast. It wasn't the worst aircraft of World War II, but it certainly wasn't the pilot favourite. This gorgeous footage was sent to us by the good folks over at the Commemorative Air Force. They still fly an SB2C one of the later variants with the bugs worked out of it. She's a favourite at air shows and she's painted up to look like a machine from the USS Franklin. Ultimately, the Helldiver did prove itself in combat, but that's probably more of a testament to the grit and determination of the brave carrier pilots who did their best with what they had at hand. Now this next one kind of hurts because it's just so damn pretty. The Messerschmitt Me-210 was developed by the legendary company which didn't have a reputation for failure, but this offering from the German design team would prove to be a stinker. With such poor performance it was pulled from units and completely redesigned. In 1937, even before the legendary Bf-110 had actually fully spread its wings, Messerschmitt's design team embarked on creating its successor. The goal was to produce a more advanced, versatile aircraft capable of excelling in roles like heavy fighter, reconnaissance, and light bombing duties. See, in those days, just before the war's outbreak, the Luftwaffe, and many air forces around the world, had grand ideas for what future aerial combat might look like and what kinds of aircraft would dominate the skies. In the First War, heavy fighters with tail gunners like the Bristol F-2B had proved themselves to be a worthy adversary, so a modern equivalent made total sense. The Bf-110 Zerstörer, or Destroyer, was conceived in 1935 to be a powerful fighter with a one-hit punch, packing cannons and machine guns into the nose that didn't need to converge like guns mounted on wings do. It was meant to serve as a bomber destroyer or a long-range harasser, and when the war began, lessons were quickly learned though. The 110 did pretty well over Poland, Norway and the Low Countries, but then came France and the Battle of Britain. The 110 was trying to fulfill a close escort role for German bombers, which was something it really wasn't designed for, and it proved tragically bad at it when faced with swarms of nimble, single-seat British fighters. In the French campaign, 60 Bf-110s were shot down in just over 3 weeks. In August 1940, at the height of the Battle of Britain, 30 were shot down in a single day. The Zerstörergruppen, or units operating the 110, began the battle with 237 aircraft, and by September 1940, they had just over 30 left. But Messerschmitt and the German Air Ministry, the RLM, weren't entirely convinced that the Zerstörer concept wasn't worth pursuing. In 1938, the RLM had issued a specification for a replacement for the 110, capable of a whole lot of things: air-to-air combat, ground attack, dive bombing, and fast reconnaissance. Arado entered its AR-240 design, but ultimately the contract went to Messerschmitt. Who else, after all, would be better suited to replace the Bf-110? And just like the Helldiver, 1,000 were ordered even before the first prototype had flown. Messerschmitt's engineers envisaged a platform that would improve on the 110 and bring an edge to the war in the air. But what came out of the production lines resembled less a high-performance warbird and more a high-maintenance, unpredictable nightmare of a machine. The 210 featured a sleeker fuselage than the 110, redesigned tapered wings for higher speeds, and innovations like a bomb bay within the nose to reduce drag. On paper, it promised impressive performance, aiming for speeds in excess of 380 miles per hour, even with its twin Daimler-Benz DB601 engines that had been used on the 110 before it. There were some genuinely clever additions too. The 210 mounted twin defensive guns in little electrically controlled barbettes either side of the fuselage that couldn't shoot off the 210's tail, and a pair of air brakes were mounted to the wings to assist with diving. That, and the plane just looked spectacular. It borrowed a lot from the 110, but the RLM must have been thrilled by this modern-looking, aerodynamic aircraft that offered excellent pilot visibility thanks to its short nose. The Me-210's first flight on September 5th, 1939, quickly dispelled any illusions of grandeur. Dr. Hermann Wuster, test pilot, hated it. He said performance was totally unacceptable. There were severe stability issues, with the aircraft exhibiting unpredictable yawing and a tendency to snake through the air even during level flight. Its pitch handling was verging on dangerous. Messerschmitt's designers must have been shocked. They rushed back to the drawing board and redesigned the prototype's tail, fitting a single big fin to fix the yaw, but it didn't do much to help. The situation escalated from concerning to dangerous when the second prototype, the 210 V2, was lost in September 1940. The aircraft entered an uncontrolled spin, forcing the pilot to bail out. Chief Test Pilot Fritz Vendel later remarked that the 210 possessed all the least desirable attributes an airplane could possess. Harsh. But also, just like the Helldiver, the Me-210 was issued to frontline units. Germany was at war, and production was well underway, with Me-210 A0s and A1s just rolling off the production lines in 1941. For those brave and perhaps unsuspecting souls who piloted the 210, the experience was like trying to ride a mechanical bull with wings. The aircraft's tendency to enter sudden stalls and spins became legendary and made every flight a test of nerves and skill. The Messerschmitt 210's handling quirks were so notorious that pilots began to question its very existence. One Luftwaffe man mused that, to us, it was inconceivable that they could get that airplane into mass production with those problems. They should have found that out beforehand. For some units training on the 210, the casualty rate over Germany was as bad as it had been in combat on the Russian front. Despite the series of unfortunate events, production of the Me-210 pressed on. It took an astounding 16 prototypes and 94 pre-production models to address the worst of the flaws, a stark contrast to the 5 prototypes and 28 pre-production units required for the brilliant Focke-Wulf FW-190. The aircraft's deficiencies were so pronounced that production lines reverted to manufacturing the very Bf-110s that the Messerschmitt 210 was meant to replace. And ultimately, the Bf-110 would remain in service and use until the end of the war. In fact, Willy Messerschmitt's own reputation suffered significant damage. He resigned as head of his own company and became the technical director. Hermann Göring, head of the German Luftwaffe, supposedly once quipped that his own tombstone should read, "He would have lived longer, but for the 210. Good one, Hermann. The 210's issues were many, but the worst of the behaviour stemmed from its relatively compact size. That the fuselage was around 1 metre too short. It suffered from severe directional instability and a high tendency for side slip. Its wing design and tail configuration, intended to improve that high-speed performance, inadvertently created aerodynamic quirks that resulted in uncontrollable yaw and roll at moments you just didn't want those things. Messerschmitt's engineers had tried to cram all those advanced features into the Me-210 at once, like those air brakes, the bomb bay doors, the electric gun turrets. They're all quite clever, but the airframe itself was proving to be the aircraft's undoing, never mind how advanced the systems were that had been packed into it. In a fascinating bit of wartime trivia, the Japanese had actually shown great interest in the Me-210, and one was even purchased and delivered via U-boat in 1943. The Japanese Kawasaki company's engineers reviewed the thing, and they too found it to be unmaneuverable and likely to enter an unrecoverable spin. Then the landing gear was damaged, so with no spare parts, the 210 was dismantled for scrapping, but what parts the Japanese did like were made use of in the development of the Rikugun Ki-93 and the Tachikawa Ki-74. You can only hope the Japanese kept their receipt and got a refund. Interestingly, the 210 found a fan in the Hungarian Air Force. In fact, more than 260 of the type were licensed built in Hungary, the CA-1, and they saw service on the Eastern Front. This plane fielded the uprated DB605 engine, lengthened the fuselage, and changed the taper of the wings. That, and they installed heavier firepower, including 40mm Bofors automatic cannons, which was a very scary weapon indeed. It found some success with the Hungarians, who generally liked it, but still considered it a handful to fly. But the Luftwaffe was finished with the Me-210 and wanted Messerschmitt to fix their mess. In an effort to salvage the project and maybe save some face, Messerschmitt's engineers went back to the drawing board. In March 1942, Messerschmitt 210s altered with longer and deeper fuselages and slatted wings, among other things, reached frontline units, and they seemed to perform all right. They saw service in the Med, bombing with Kampfgeschwader units and doing heavy fighter stuff with Zerstörergeschwader units. Messerschmitt was heartened by this, and they decided to press on with making the changes. New versions with uprated DB603 engines and modified, longer fuselages performed quite well. Crucially, the wing lost its taper and became straighter. In autumn 1942, the Messerschmitt 210's improved version was tested and then approved for production just a few months later. In a clever bit of spin doctoring, this brand new aircraft was referred to as the Messerschmitt Me-410. Ultimately, the design turned out to be pretty good. The 410 was used for a bewildering array of roles, from the original heavy fighter job to the ubiquitous Schnellbomber role that the Luftwaffe was so obsessed with. There were the U-1, A-3 and B-3 recon variants, the U-4 armed with a single impressive 50mm cannon, and the menacing B-2-U-4, which packed a 50mm gun and two Mk-108 30mm for bomber hunting. Then there was a spread of high-altitude versions, with special turbo-supercharged variants of the Daimler-Benz DB603 engine and much longer wings. Hell, just for the fun of it, there was even a torpedo bomber version. So the Luftwaffe finally got its nice new Swiss Army knife of a heavy fighter just in time for Germany to begin being bombed day and night by the USAAF and the RAF. Ironically, it was the old Bf-110 that would emerge as the hero of Germany's night fighter units, with aces like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer racking up impressive victory tallies. But the 410 proved itself, in the right conditions, to be a very dangerous opponent to US bomber crews during the day, with some mounting the Werfergranate 21 mortars that could swat B-17s and B-24s clear out of the sky. The Messerschmitt 410 was a success. It's just hard to believe its origins came from such an inglorious failure. Messerschmitt's designers were clearly on the right track with the 210. It's just surprising to see them stumble so badly. Like Curtiss, they had a track record of producing sound, successful designs. You can only imagine that maybe political interference and the harsh realities of wartime production timelines might have got a bit in the way. The Me-410 is one of my favourite fighters of the war. I mean, just look at it, it's spectacular. But you definitely wouldn't have caught me in the cockpit of a 210 anytime soon. And finally, we turn to Italy's Regia Aeronautica for yet again another beautiful looking airplane whose sleek airframe was actually hiding some pretty worrying behavioural quirks. Breda, Italian manufacturer, established by Ernesto Breda way back in 1886, had a long and impressive history of making all kinds of things, like rolling stock, locomotives, machine guns, trams, you name it. But they also began to manufacture aircraft and had a crack at designing them themselves. In the lead up to the Second World War, probably their most successful design had been the BA-65, a monoplane ground attack aircraft that was okay, I guess. They went on to be decimated by the RAF over North Africa, but we'll come back to that in a minute. But before the war had even begun, Italy's Air Force was keen to replace sluggish old kites like the 65, so Breda got to work. They had a crack with the BA-75, which looked suspiciously similar to the plane that had gone before it, but presumably performance was quite poor because only one prototype was ever built. Now look, I love Breda's prototypes. They kind of look like a mishmash of so many others that have almost been AI generated, like the BA-201, which looks like the result of smushing together a Junkers 87 Stuka, a BF-109 and a Hawker Hurricane. Or the BA-46, just a long, thin, stretched Junkers 52. They even made their own constellation. They're all wacky and goofy and kind of fun. But the design submitted in 1936 to the Regia Aeronautica was none of those things. It looked mean. Enter the Ba.88, a genuinely cool-looking plane that totally broke the mold on Breda's design ethos. The Air Force's specification had called for a fast, heavy fighter/ground attack aircraft, not dissimilar to the Bf-110, I suppose. The first prototype built by Breda was incredibly slick and genuinely quite impressive. It featured a thin, tapered fuselage flanked by two enormous radial engines and a small single tail behind. When the prototype first took to the sky, it cracked a top speed in excess of 300 miles per hour and went on to break a string of world speed over distance records. Part of the secret to its success was the focus on streamlining. The undercarriage could fold away during flight, sure, but so could the tail wheel. That was pretty clever. Testing and refining resulted in a prototype that fielded a pair of 1,000 horsepower Piaggio P11 engines, a licensed version of a French engine, which was itself a licensed version of the British Bristol Jupiter from 1918, and a twin fin tail, presumably to improve the field of fire for that defensive tail gun. But then something weird happened. Breda's brilliant invention, the darling of Mussolini's propaganda machine, began to misbehave. It turns out the plane had been trimmed and configured specifically for speed trials and test runs, not for combat and actual loading. The Ba.88 Lynx proved surprisingly sluggish in flight. It was a handful to control, something that got exponentially worse the more equipment was added, like radios and weapons. It turns out the specification issued by the Regia Aeronautica had called for some bizarre features, like, say, a strength sufficient to sustain 12 Gs. Now, trained pilots with anti-G suits and the correct technique can survive around 9 or 10 Gs in short bursts. Astronauts in rockets at liftoff are subjected to about 3 Gs sustained, so what the Italian Air Force expected the Ba.88 to be doing at 12 Gs is beyond me, especially when you consider that although the plane might be able to survive those 12 Gs, the poor pilot and gunner inside wouldn't exactly be so fortunate. To answer this call for bewildering G tolerance, Breda had built the Lynx with a main structure comprised of steel tubes welded together like a truss, kind of like you might expect to see in an older fighter from the First World War. But instead of having a fuselage covered in canvas like those older fighters, the Ba.88 had an all-metal stressed skin. The result was a heavily over-engineered structure that added a ton of weight at a time when most aircraft manufacturers were relying on monocoque structures instead, where it's the skin itself that does much of the structural heavy lifting. But by 1940, as some of the Lynx's design deficiencies were finally letting themselves be known, Italy found itself at war with France, and the Ba.88 was heading into combat. Pilots could at last get their hands on the aircraft that had won speed records for Italy. It must have actually been really exciting. Only when they throttled up and tried to lift off for the first time, they must have been shocked by how sluggish the thing was, how reluctant to climb. Even with a modest combat load, the Ba.88 was lethargic, but heavily laden with bombs, the thing wouldn't even climb at all. Even worse still, Italy's Air Force was destined to fight in North Africa, where the arduous conditions of desert fighting would require the already struggling Piaggio engines to be stifled with sand filters. They ran extremely hot and inefficiently, but still the Lynx struggled on. Early on, Ba.88 pilots encountered little resistance, but even so, the deficiencies were so bad, their planes still had to be pulled from service within just 5 months. There are cases where Ba.88s couldn't even lift off from the tarmac. Speeds fell far below those original 300 miles per hour, more like 155, where they would obviously be sitting ducks for the likes of the RAF Spitfires, Hurricanes and P-40s if they could even get off the ground. One attack on Sidi El Barani had to be called off because the Ba.88s tasked with the mission couldn't gain enough altitude or even maintain an adequate formation. So it was that the once promising Lynx was pulled dramatically from service. The remaining airframes actually did find some use, as target decoys for patrolling British aircraft. In fact, a shipment of brand new Ba.88s that arrived from Italy went straight to the scrap heap. Amazingly, Breda didn't give up on their beloved Lynx. Through 1941 and 42, they redesigned and tested variants with lighter loads, different engines, longer wingspans, you name it. But the end result was still a poor, sluggish, mopey pig of a plane that just wouldn't perform. A new and improved model, the Ba.88M, was delivered to an Air Force unit for testing exactly one day before Italy surrendered. Go figure. Incredibly, the failure of the Ba.88 left Italy with nothing but the tragically outdated biplane Fiat CR32 and the good old Breda Ba.65, which the Lynx was supposed to have replaced. They were, of course, decimated by the RAF. So what about all those record-setting flights the Ba.88 had set back before the war? Well, it is possible it had done the job in its pre-military configuration. In fact, the FAI, the World Air Sports Federation, ratified the record for speed over a kilometre in 1937. But you do have to wonder if somehow the fascist government was able to simply make up the figures to build hype for their new plane, and then had to suffer the consequences when the truth of the matter revealed itself, with the pathetic Lynx struggling to even lift off the ground. Breda had begun their manufacturing careers with trains. It just seems fitting that the Lynx seemed to handle like one in the air. Can you tell I was proud of that joke? So there you have it. 3 poorly thought out aircraft from a conflict that brought us so many similar stories. From the sadly underpowered Blackburn Botha to the spontaneously combusting Heinkel HE-177. Join us next time here on Airliner Designs when we explore more of World War II's worst aircraft design failures.